So we are here to have a little introductory conversation around pay equity, with this idea that there are lots of folks having these conversations all around. We wanted to start this one tonight with a couple of definitions, a little bit of research, that kind of stuff. So Elsa, I'd love to start off with a definition of pay equity. How do you think about this?
So the simplest form of pay equity is compensating worker roles without discrimination. And so I think sometimes people have kind of a siloed view of what pay equity is. And it's important to remember that it should cross different areas of an organization. It should cross different unions or non-union workers, and really be holistic as far as who are arts workers, removing the boundary between artists and administrators, and then also to different kinds of compensation. So, wages, paid time off, health benefits, 401k, those sorts of things.
Right. And I know that you've also, on the website, on our team and the pay equity standards, you've mentioned that pay equity might look different at one organization as opposed to another organization, right? So would you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, so on our team formed the pay equity standards, which is basically a tool for organizations to use to establish pay equity, and also a public recognition of that pay equity. And so this really came out of interviews that we did with about 50 organizational leaders in Chicago and elsewhere, to see what was the barrier to pay equity, what did they need to make forward movement, and really realized that they needed a pathway, like a roadmap, an on-ramp to pay equity. And so the system is essentially a checklist that uses kind of three pillars of pay equity. Working conditions is one, transparency is the second, and accountability is the third. Thinking that if you do things that, prop those up, then you will have a good base for pay equity. It was really trying to have this pathway that, gave people tools, but then also welcomed in audience members and foundations to recognize organizations that were using pay equity within their organization.
Gotcha. And as you have developed the pay equity standards, I know there were 4 questions that you were asking. I'm curious of what that process was like and what those questions were.
Yeah, so in these interviews we did, I asked several questions that were all the same, and I tried not to influence them in their answers. And the first one was, what is pay equity? Because realizing that there were wildly different definitions. Some people thought it was just paying people on time. That was pay equity. Some people had a really more nuanced, holistic view of what pay equity was. And so obviously learned from that people really needed some education on what it was and what it could look like. And then the next question we would ask is, what would motivate you to start a pay equity process in your organization? Thinking if we knew that, we could better motivate companies in a positive way to start making changes. And how would it benefit those companies so that they could start reflecting on the benefits? There are tons of benefits, and I think sometimes it seems like a really expensive thing to undertake when really there are lots of returns that you get, as far as culture and community and financial and safety and all of those areas. And then asking what the barriers are to starting a pay equity process. Thinking again, if we knew what the barriers were, we could start to remove them. And a lot of the barriers were not knowing how to start, being worried of a public backlash if they started talking about new practices that they had done badly in the past, that might bring up feelings of resentment, those sorts of things. And then the final question was, what tools do they need to start the process? And from all of those answers, really, it was made clear that we needed to make something like the pay equity standards that was a tool that would both give people, a structure to start with, And then also bring in that public recognition aspect. It's inspired by the organic and fair trade food labels. And it's a celebration, essentially, of companies that are centering pay equity within their organization.
Great, thank you. And was there anything in terms of those interviews, were there any commonalities that you encountered or things that you found particularly surprising or exciting or terrifying?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes, and this kind of gets back to the siloed part, like it's really, as a worker, it's really easy to think, um, you know, companies don't care about this, they're not interested in this. And I think as an administrator, and I kind of have had all of these different roles, so I see it from those different angles. But as an administrator, it's easy to, you know, be really focused on how difficult it is and what the budget looks like, and not be thinking about the benefits that will be brought to you, and having that fear of what happens if we start saying we're doing things differently, and it offends somebody who we hurt in the past. And so that was really eye-opening, and really made me realize that if we, the big old we, whoever that is, if we as a community give some tools and some structure, and have a celebratory space that allows small incremental changes, maybe it's not the end goal, but we can celebrate these steps along the way, that some real change could happen in a way that it hadn't so far.
Yeah, I know during our prep conversation, getting ready for tonight, I had a little bit of like oh, right, because the definition, that simplest definition that you shared about pay equity being compensating workers without discrimination, which we dropped in the chat. We'll also follow up with materials, so you all will have this available to you, but that actually the pay equity doesn't necessarily speak to good pay, right? That first step in is, are we doing this equitably? And I think one of the things, like I know conversations that I've gotten into where the concept of pay equity has been conflated with the idea of good pay, and nobody's against good pay either, right? But as that first step, like how do we, if the step in is, can we do this in a way that feels equitable, and then can we do this in a way that feels good, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think, especially being in the arts, it's kind of this, it balances between being a profession and a passion. And sometimes that can be a bad balance, and it can weigh too much on one or the other. But you can have pay equity if everybody's being paid, small amounts, or if everybody's volunteer, right? And the pay equity standards does have benchmarks for local minimum wages and local living wages, because it's the goals of that program is to recognize pay equity, but for professional theater companies. But yeah, it's it doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be a thriving wage, for sure.
Right. And that's where our conversation tonight, we're hoping to start, right? So this idea of we are Second Story, we are planning to have multiple of these town halls, and some of them really will be grappling with those barriers, right? Or grappling with like, how do we get other people on board? We really wanted to start with that idea of, what does it mean to thrive? Right. So we hear about a minimum wage, we hear about a living wage, but also there is this thriving wage, right? And thriving goes beyond just the wages that we are receiving. And we invite, as we enter into this conversation tonight, to really think about thriving writ large. So certainly it might be related to compensation, but it also might be a much wider kind of brainstorming process than just really talking about the actual wages that we are paid.